First of all, this is data from the Superintendent Lab. This is a lab that is run out of the University of Texas at Austin by Dr. Rachel White. And so they took a look and tried to figure out, okay, it seems like there's a lot of superintendent turnover. How much is there? You can see on this map that in the darkest blue state, which here is Oklahoma, there was 30% of superintendents. So in at least 30% of districts, there was a superintendent turnover since 2020. And in the darkest red states, there was 75%. What does that mean? Ultimately, more than 40% of districts in our nation have experienced superintendent turnover since 2020. So please drop in the chat, has your local district where you live, your school system, have you experienced superintendent turnover since 2020? We know that turnover stalls initiatives. We know that relationships have to start over again at ground zero. We know the upheaval that this causes. And so curious to know, has this impacted your local school system? Caitlin, what are you seeing in the chat?
4 for 4 so far. 5 for 5. Yes, I've had 2 turnovers in some cases. Yes, I mean, we're seeing it's prevalent and you all are experiencing it.
Absolutely. And in fact, superintendents report stress levels that are double that of any other working adult. But let's talk a little bit about what parents and non-parents think about politics in the classroom. So this survey was done by Ipsos, so a national survey, and the headline is, most people oppose candidates who politicize schools. So you'll see here if you take a look, most people say, I wouldn't vote for a candidate who opposes teachers using students' preferred pronouns in the classroom. I wouldn't vote for a candidate who supports book bans. I wouldn't vote for a candidate who supports curriculum restrictions around race, gender, and sexual orientation. And although that is what the majority of people said who took that survey, when we take a closer look, America has legislated itself into competing red and blue versions of education. Let's take a look at this map from the Washington Post. So you can see here that the darker red a state is, the more restrictions they have enacted regarding education legislation on race, sex, and gender, and the darker blue, the more expansions. So what does this mean? Approximately 3/4 of our nation's school children are now subject to state measures that either say there needs to be additional teaching on these topics, or they are subject to measures that severely restrict or outright ban such lessons. Since 2017, 38 states have implemented a total of 114 laws, rules, and orders related to these topics. And so most of them, 66%, are restricting or prohibiting lessons on such topics. The division in education policy aligns strongly with political lines. So around 90% of restricted laws have been passed in states that voted for Donald Trump in the last election, and 80% of expansive laws have been enacted in states that voted for Joe Biden. So we want you to drop it in the chat. Are you surprised that when you see that number, 114 pieces of legislation across our country have been dropped since 2017 related to lessons on race, sex, and gender in public schools? Are you surprised? 0, not at all. It's what I expected. Or 5, I'm shocked whether you thought that's more than you thought or maybe less. So please drop a number 0 to 5 in the chat. And if you put 5, let us know if you thought it would be more or less. Caitlin, what are you seeing in the chat?
Unanimous at 0.
This is confirming what we were feeling, right? We felt like all of us, it seems like this is going on. And as the data shows, yeah, this has been going on. So there was this nationwide survey done pretty recently by the University of Southern California, and they tried to figure out, okay, what really are the differences in perception of the roles of public schools based along political lines? What they found overall, Americans, regardless of political affiliation, value public education, but they differ right along partisan lines on what schools should teach and at what grade levels, at what it means to be age appropriate or right time. So let's take a look. There was widespread agreement really on 3 major topics. 1, basic academics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's really important. providing a free public education is crucial, and teaching about government and civics is vital. But then we start to see differences. And we'll go through these differences, but I do want to say, even here you can see, it's never going to be 0% of one political party and 100% of another. There's nuances within parties. People have their own individual thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, but we're definitely seeing some trends. So it's not everybody who might identify as Republican or Democrat, but we are seeing some data that definitely tell a story. So the first question on this survey that was given to over 9,000 adults, they said, do you think that it's an important role of public schools to teach children the importance of embracing differences? And you can see here around 75% of Democrats said yes, but around 35% of Republicans said the same. Let's take a look more specifically at racial topics. And on the next couple of slides, I'll show you what we mean a little more specifically by that. But broadly, what we're seeing is at the elementary level, around 65% of Democrats support some of this education in schools, whether that is acknowledging native lands, whether that is talking about slavery, and 30% of Republicans feel the same. You can take a look at high school and that gap closes a pretty good bit. Then now we're seeing most people think we need to be able to talk about racial topics. What does this look like at elementary school? As I mentioned, this could be anything from teachers acknowledging native lands, civil rights demonstrations, slavery is the main cause of the Civil War, why Thanksgiving can be hurtful to some groups. Take a look at that one. So it's 5 from the bottom. 16% of Republicans say that should be taught to elementary students. 61% of Democrats say the same. And so you can really see that there is a marked difference when we look at this. The purple means people who identify as another party, such as independent, and gray is that overall. But let's take a look at high school. That gap closed a good bit, nearly across the board. Now, most individuals, most adults, regardless of political affiliation, think, yes, we do need to talk about ways some whites opposed the civil rights movement. Yes, we do need to acknowledge that slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. Teachers should acknowledge native lands. We definitely need to talk about equal treatment regardless of skin color. So the big takeaway that this survey found about racial topics is that although there was difference among party lines for what should be taught at elementary school, Democrats said, yes, we need to be able to talk about racial topics at elementary school. Republicans mostly said no. Overwhelmingly, both said yes at high school. But the same wasn't true for LGBTQ topics. You can see here, and again, we'll go into what more specifically are those. This could be anything from, if my child's teacher is gay, is it okay for them to have a picture of their spouse on their desk, and so on. And so you can see here at elementary school, not even 10% of Republicans felt like it was okay to address any of these topics. That could even be a book that has a same-sex couple. Half of Democrats said the same, that it would be appropriate that there would be some LGBTQ topics in elementary school. When you take a look at high school, the gap is still really wide. Then we have around 85% of Democrats saying, yes, there's a place for that. But you have around 45% of Republicans, so not a majority. Let's take a closer look. So what do we mean by LGBTQ topics a little more specifically? Most people think that being kind to others matter and standing up for others matters. But then when we take a look at having a book with an opposite sex love story, so even then there's not widespread agreement among Republicans. There's an issue with that. But then we take a look at the teacher having the same sex spouse on the desk. 33% of Republicans say that's okay. 67% of Democrats do. We probably all remember the penguin book. There was a big controversy on it about there being the same-sex penguin adoption book. 24% of Republicans said yes. Nearly 70% of Democrats felt that that was appropriate. And you can see more, a teacher being openly transgender, LGBTQ friendly decorations. Take a look at that one, LGBTQ friendly decorations. So say a pride flag, 9% of Republicans say that's okay, 51% of Democrats. Let's look at high school. And so now here you can see that there's more adults across all party lines who have agreement, but still a minority of Republicans agree, a majority of Democrats agree. So the headline for LGBTQ topics is that is very much a divisive issue. Almost exactly, you can look at it by party line, much more so than you can, again, by race, which we see most people agree that those topics should be taught at high school. That's not the case for LGBTQ topics. So now that you have seen some of this national perception data, please in the chat drop a word or a phrase. We just love to know your reaction. What are you thinking? What's your reflection on seeing this national perception data and what parents think, or and adults, also non-parents, think is appropriate for public school children to be taught, and seeing that difference among how people politically identify? Caitlin, what are we seeing in the chat?
A trend, Anissa, around not surprised and disappointed, and not surprised but still disappointed. Not new, kind of more of the same in terms of the partisan divide and range that we're seeing. Don't worry, you all, there's good news ahead. We're going to move into what you can do, despite perhaps the consistency of some of these data trends that you all are used to seeing.
Absolutely. I'll turn it over to you, Caitlin, to kick us off through that segment.
Great. So Anissa just gave us a bit of the national landscape, both legislatively and also perception-wise. I'm now going to shift us into some real-time scenarios that are playing out and offer up some of that common ground messaging and messaging architecture to equip you and others in your community, perhaps your district leaders as well, with some strategies to bring people together, at least around values, if not opinions and approaches. So this slide here is in data in response to what should parents do when they disagree on content that's being taught in the classroom. And I don't need to tell this group that there are whole different sorts of parenting values and philosophies and styles out there. And it's back to school time, so we're gonna see them in full relief. But you'll see at the top here that there is agreement and strong amount of agreement on the far right here of talking to a child about that opposition to what's being taught at home. The idea that family is everything to children, and that children and parents together are forming kind of the values and the character of their kids. That is a tight distribution among Republicans and Democrats. As we move further down the parents' moves, you'll see more of a disproportionate agreement from Republican parents on what we would describe as kind of activist or influencing the behaviors and decisions of educators in the school. So that's where asking the teacher to consider changing the lesson in future years skews more Republican. Asking the teacher to change the lesson this year skews much more Republican. If we look at the next slide, it's a glimpse or a snapshot of what an expectation is for the school when a parent disagrees with what is being taught. And in this case, there's actually kind of no consensus in any partisan way or otherwise. You see parents' responses and expectations are all over the place, from the school teaching the lesson as planned to the school modifying the lesson, a healthy chunk of parents saying, I don't know what the school should do in this scenario. So let's play this out a step further with a little bit more granular focus on how to listen and how to talk about what could be divisive, contentious, tough topics this school year. So imagine this. This is a poll where parents were prompted to take on the persona of a principal. Here's the situation. Nearly 2/3 of adults support a parent's choice to opt their child out of lessons that include content that they do not support. So in this scenario, again, a parent playing as a principal, you are asked to decide whether to honor a parent's request that their child do an alternate activity during an upcoming, quote, history lesson that includes content that the parent disagrees with. If you're just given that as a scenario with no other context and you're prompted to be a principal, 57% of parents playing the role of principal would say, yeah, I would honor that parent's request. Now, here's a revision, another variation on that same scenario. Same hypothetical scenario, but you, a parent prompted to be a principal, are given this additional context that the teacher believes all students should participate because learning about content that they might not otherwise hear or learn about helps them. Your child's student may see a new perspective, learn to be a critical thinker, or simply learn an important new fact. And it can be hard for a teacher to accommodate every parent's wishes for every lesson for every child. With that additional context, that 57% approve the parents opt out plummets down to 41%. What does this show us? That additional context, how a scenario is messaged, can have a significant effect on someone's response, reaction to that same situation. So what does this look like in practice? What are the levers we can pull, whether we are listening or speaking directly? How you communicate is as important as the words that you say, if not more so. When you communicate by email, which all of us do every day, myself included, 100% of the communication of the message is carried in the word choice. What is on that screen? What pops up on our phone on the go? When we move over to, oh goodness, speaking of body language, I don't know if anyone saw that, but I got a little thumbs up on Zoom there automatically. Speaking of ways to communicate, when we shift from email to phone, the message is 82% your tone and volume, and only 18% of your words used. And finally, moving further on that spectrum, when we are speaking face to face, in an office, in a parking lot, in the grocery store, the message that we are delivering, 55% is body language. How open, how relaxed, how expressive we are. 38% is the tone and volume of the words that we say, and only 7% of that message is carried in the words that we use. So think about that spectrum as we dive in and invest time in ways of building common ground or listening with folks who we do not agree with. Here are some do's and don'ts, whether you are advocating for your kid or representing a district, or frankly, just having a conversation with a partner or spouse. Some do's of communication to take down the temperature and de-escalate any conflict. On the do's side, use plain language. We have a great tendency, especially as educators or former educators, to get swept up in some education jargon. To the extent that you can, use plain language. Number two, highlight the importance of students, period. And students feeling accepted, valued, celebrated for who they are. Third, focus on shared values, like what our children learn and why and how it contributes to success later in life. As Anisha shared, there is broad, widespread bipartisan agreement on the basics of academics and why that is critical to a child's development and success over time. Fourth, reaffirming your support for parent-teacher partnership and parental involvement. We know that there has been a whole lot of energy around the parents' rights, jargon and banner, and let's not let that force undermine the imperative of parents and teachers working in partnership of students and children. And then fifth and finally, asking questions to demonstrate curiosity and really lead us all toward common ground. So in this next view, and I'm not gonna voice over the don'ts column. We'll hand them out on slides. It's more important to dwell on what we want to be true, and you can keep the right side in your back pocket. So we wanted to offer up a winning message, we'll call it, a message that galvanizes broad agreement across a wide partisan and ideological and geographical range of parents. And this is from late-breaking research in the past month from Lake Research Partners. The headline here is that public schools create a community of learning and belonging. I'm not going to read every word here, but I will highlight a few phrases that public education is the great equalizer of our country, that is important to learn alongside people from different backgrounds, that social skills and resilience are needed skills for the long term of navigating life, and that public schools play a vital role. I'm just going to give a beat of silence and let you read over some of these 4 statements here. And feel free to put in the chat any words or phrases that really speak to you as compelling, as moving, and as language that feels pretty consensus and broadly agreeable to members of your community. So with that, those kind of common ground phrases and ideas, we wanted to introduce a messaging framework of how to actually construct and design what you're saying, and prepare to respond to what others are saying. So here's the overall framework, and I'm going to zip through this. It might be unsatisfying, but again, we'll share these slides. The first, starting at the top of the pyramid, is to really align with shared values and start the conversation from a place where you know there is agreement. Even with the most insipid folks that you disagreements, there might be 10% of that agreement to start with, and that's where you start. You then want to define the impact. When possible, framing their views positively rather than negatively. Third, being curious and asking questions that are open-ended and trying to uncover what's below the surface of whatever someone is starting with. And fourth, landing on a call to action, being clear on next steps, even if it does feel like incremental progress and not like you're going to solve the whole problem, agree on what's next. So here's a sample message. This sample message revolves around a fourth grader and parents' opposition to having content related to slavery, and a conversation between a principal and a parent about their parent's request to opt out of that content. So starting with, something to the extent of, I know that we both agree that children need to learn topics at age appropriate levels. And that I'm also certain we both agree that slavery was a very dark chapter in our nation's history. That's where we start. Simple, non-jargon, where do we agree? And then defining the impact of teachers. I'm not going to read every word here, but having, showing that the impact of teachers' intention and the readiness of students to actually prepare this topic really frame the positive and the value of moving in this direction, including this content and that student in the learning. Third is being curious. And remember, again, it's not just the words that we're using, but how we are communicating through nonverbals, body language, and ideally in person. Have I addressed your concerns? And just ending there and then listening. Sometimes folks just need to really share and feel heard and acknowledged, even if you land on a place of disagreement still. And then fourth, call to action, kind of synthesizing what you all discussed and offering a meeting between the child's elementary teacher and then the parent to take a deeper dive into the curriculum. Sometimes this radical candor we have found in working with superintendents, kind of opening up all doors and information access, can really de-escalate and defuse someone's concern because it is based on just hearsay or speculation or inferences, not fact. All right, so that's one roll through. I'm curious if anyone has an example of common ground wording or scenarios that you'd like to share in the chat, something that you've used personally that we either presented tonight or something else that you think we missed, or any other questions. And I see one related to religious discrimination that I'm glad has surfaced here. So I hope we have a chance at the end to come back to that one.
All right. Thank you so much, Caitlin. We're going to wrap up this evening with helping and just sharing. What can you do when you feel like you've been backed into a corner? What do you do when the conversation is tough? How can you try to keep it on even footing? But what can you do if it's going sideways? So let's dive in. First, as Caitlin mentioned, you want to start with common ground. There's always overlap, even if It's just that everybody cares about kids. Sometimes that is all you have to start with. And remembering that this relational work and why it matters to listen, why it matters to start with common ground, that all the facts and statistics may be on your side, but the person on the other side of that conversation can't hear it if everything in the room feels really elevated. We are all subject to confirmation bias. Think about the news you consume. It's probably what you agree with. And say you're thinking, no, I listen to a lot of news. Well, how about this? Research shows that parents can only ever hear 2 negative things about their children before they do not trust that teacher anymore. And so you can't inundate people with facts if that relationship isn't in place. And again, leaning in with curiosity is vital. You want to keep the main thing the main thing. I don't know if some of you have seen this statistic, but humans now have a shorter attention span than goldfish. Goldfish can keep focus for 8 seconds, humans 7. So you want to keep the main thing, because if everything is important, nothing is. And so try to focus on one main point, but if you've really got to do some more, no more than 3. Know for yourself. Somebody else doesn't get to change how you show up. You get to stay true to your values. Other people can act how they want to, but you are in control of yourself. And know what lines you won't cross. We talk about this with different education leaders. This is a personal thing that everyone has to know, where you'd be willing to really make some political concessions. For example, some people say the word equity has it's been weaponized. I don't have to use that word, but I have to do equitable work. And other people say part of me doing that work is using that word. And that's a personal choice, but know for yourself what lines you won't cross when you're going into some of these conversations. Ultimately, there doesn't have to be agreement in a conversation. There has to be 2 people who felt like what they had to say was valuable and that they were respected. That gives you so much of a greater chance of having another conversation to ultimately do what all of us want to do, make things better for kids. You want to always look for ways to lower the temperature. We know not to say calm down, that never works, but look for ways to try to reduce the temperature in the room so that people can hear the facts. And use language to bridge back to shared understanding. What does that mean? Someone says something and you're like, that is not at all what I said. You can say, I'm so glad you brought that up. It gives me a chance to clarify. Or what I really want to make sure that I've been clear on is blank. And so we actually have this front and back difficult conversations guide, and there's lots of those type of wording that I just mentioned, which is called bridging and redirecting. How can you get control back of that conversation? How can you loop back? How can you say, I'm so glad you brought that up. It gives me an opportunity to highlight X. So if you can take a picture of that QR code and it goes straight to our website. It is a free resource that was recently published in partnership with some of our collaborators at Harvard on a series that was done for Ed Week. So please feel free to snap that and share it. Caitlin, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Anissa. As we wrap here, I just want to honor that, we're all coming from different perspectives and community settings and our own personal experiences with the public education system as students, as parents, as observers, as voters. So we're curious to hear from you all, any takeaways or ahas for your own application in your home communities, or anything you'd like to suggest to the group or Anissa and me as we continue to share these suggestions with district leaders, certainly, but stakeholders and constituents like you all tonight.
We did have a question in the chat. The question was about religious discrimination, I think, against non-Christians, with the rise of Christian nationalism. Why is that not, why is that topic disregarded? Now, we have been having multiple trainings on that here at Red, Wine, and Blue, but just was kind of curious to know what you all see in your spaces.
Yeah, it is certainly coming up among our superintendents. So Betty Ann, thank you for naming it. Anissa, we should do another canvassing of poll tested messaging to see, I mean, honestly, Betty Ann, just the durability and consistency of the messaging guidance that we offered from tonight is based on kind of the past 3 years of poll tested surveying, and it really has gravitated around race and LGBTQ divisive topics. Now, we serve superintendents who who are serving all of our nation's public education students. And so this topic of religious discrimination has come up this year more than ever. I do think a lot of the guidance that we shared tonight around making sure all children feel accepted and valued and celebrated for who they are and what they believe. And someone wrote in the chat too, language that I agree with. Yeah, be safe emotionally, physically, and mentally at school. Thank you, Lindsay. That checks. It's going to be interesting to see how the next, the attention on through this election cycle with increased attention to religious concepts, whether we see any daylight between the language that we know most parents agree with and or whether this has a different effect. But we're keeping a close eye on it, and I'm grateful to you for raising it tonight. Anissa, what would you add?
Grateful for the person who raised it. I think, in my intro, I'm from Mississippi. I work in Athens, Georgia. I'm Muslim. I posted about my religion on Facebook and was sent to HR to have a conversation about it when I worked in a school system. So I've lived that discrimination. I know what it feels like when, for my son, when all the other kids who were, in third grade come in with a donut because they've gone to FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and he didn't. So I've lived that, and I appreciate you for raising that question. As Caitlin mentioned, a lot of what we shared on those aligning on messaging and navigating those tough conversations, we know that those are tried and true no matter what it is, no matter what the issue at hand is. Those are ways that you can have productive conversations and moving whatever the it is forward into a more equitable place.
One of the things that is happening here a lot in Ohio, I'm not sure if it's everywhere else yet, but I'm sure it's coming. We have a group called LifeWise where they're pulling the kids out of the school during the school day. And it's the same kind of a situation that Anissa just mentioned. So if you don't want your kid to be a part of that, then, the other kids are coming back and they've got candy or they've got, some kind of goodie or of some sort, or they got to do something that the other kids didn't get to do. And it's really, some school districts have fought it, others didn't and have allowed them to come in. I see one of their buses every day as I drive my hour drive into work. And it just is really, I don't have little kids in school anymore. My youngest is 32. So I don't have to deal with this, thank goodness, but I just can't even imagine, I just can't imagine this, when the kids were in public school. Now I did send my kids to, our church for school, but that was a whole different thing. And that was a choice that I made. That wasn't, everybody had to do that in the public setting. And I was just wondering what you are hearing from your superintendents about that, because that's really big here. And I'm not sure where else in the country that is big, but it's definitely very big here in Ohio.
It's very big in Georgia too, the same thing. And as you mentioned, Julie, it's this, it's an opt-in, but like you said, then they come back to school and it's all these kids have left and had this experience and come in with the goodies or whatever, and how that feels to the others.
Yeah, it's definitely not just Ohio. Anissa mentioned Georgia. I was just talking to folks in New Hampshire about this week. And yeah, I mean, it has a cultural impact and it has an academic impact as well in terms of the momentum of togetherness that students are feeling and the instructional time. I mean, there's only so many days, so many hours of this academic school day. And so I spent my career on making sure that all students have high expectations and meaningful support for them. And so when we start exempting or fracturing the school day with other activities that are opt-in for certain sets of students, it can be destabilizing for the entire for teachers and school leaders, as well as for students and their sense of togetherness and unity. So we're keeping an eye on it as well. I see some inquiries here on where we're about to go. So it's a good segue for folks who are wondering, you know, how might I support my superintendent or teachers who are experiencing a chilling effect, or sharing information to make sure that superintendents are equipped to see around corners. And while we're not gonna eliminate political complexity, we can at least help them anticipate that and prepare for it with a little bit more foresight. So again, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. Everything that we do in the first year of a superintendent's experiences with us, which includes a whole bunch of community and just processing time for them as professionals and lots of pragmatic, tangible tools, everything is free to them personally and to your districts, to their districts. We are raising money from philanthropy to make sure cost is never a prohibitive factor for anyone who needs support. So we do bring superintendents together, try to create a sense of authentic community, honestly, a lot like the vibe at Red Wine and Blue of togetherness and shared learning. We focus on public engagement and strategic communication so that superintendents can be even more effective stewards, community leaders, democracy builders in their districts. And then we really try to stick with them so that no superintendent or district leader feels alone. And we are just a Slack message away or a text to Anissa or me or a member of my team so that they feel like they're never alone in staying strong for all kids and in staying in seat, because our country needs a set of stable leaders to stand up for all kids. So if you are interested in spreading the word about Leading Now and have a relationship with a school board member or a principal or maybe even your superintendent in your district, feel free to draw from the language that Anissa just zipped into the chat, and we'll be sure to follow up. My personal email will again include a follow-up note with the slides, but I'm Caitlin at leadingnow.org. Anissa at leadingnow.org, and we're happy to have to any follow-up conversations, regardless of where they lead, to try to grow our network and most importantly, grow the ecosystem of common ground, all kids advocates out there to protect and bolster our public education system through it and beyond this election cycle. So thank you all for your engagement and your leadership at this important time. It's a big opportunity and a big responsibility for us to make it happen for our country's kids.